Exactly 255 years ago, in 1768, sailors lowered their sails in Sunderland. They demanded fair wages and better working conditions. The sailors' action was one of the very first major work stoppages of the modern era. The ruling circle spoke of mutiny. Another way of saying lowering the sails is striking the sails. Because of the sailors' action in Sunderland, the word strike became common in English for work stoppages. Mutiny at sea and stoppage of work on land are thus intimately linked. Since then, the social struggle has gone up and down like the waves on the sea. But it's there, open and offensive, or dormant and waiting, until the sails are struck. In London, social struggles have been re-emerging since last summer. I hear stories of healthcare workers who are going on strike for the first time, something they never thought they would do. I read about a huge wave of strikes, and I want to see that with my own eyes. So I get on the train to London, where Grace Blakeley, a young left-wing economist, lives. If anyone can make a clear analysis of that summer of discontent in the United Kingdom, it's her.
A lot of hospitals in the UK have been forced to set up food banks for their staff because their staff, particularly nursing staff, low-paid staff, junior doctors, can't afford to buy food.
The hospitals themselves?
Yeah, have set up food banks, which is just absolutely, it's crazy, the levels of just poverty that there are in this country at the moment. I think a lot of the world probably thinks of the UK as a rich economy, and it is. But we are seeing levels of poverty and destitution, indebtedness, homelessness that we haven't seen in decades. A big part of it is the cost of living crisis.
She has to repeat that because I didn't quite believe it. A hospital having to set up food banks for its own staff, and that in one of the richest countries in the world, people with a job are still poor.
So I just think for a lot of people, they're in this situation where they can't afford just to live well, and they look to the future and things don't look like they're going to be getting better because there's no chance of progress in the job that they're in. You look to the future and economists are saying we're going to have if not a recession, probably a recession, but if not then just an extended period of very slow growth, and there just seems to be very little hope for most people that things are going to get better if things don't change.
Fuel prices are rising, food prices are rising, the prices of goods are rising, which is what is called inflation. In other words, your money is worth less and less. But that's not a natural phenomenon at all, Grace says. It's not something that just happens like a leaf falling from the tree. There are reasons why prices are rising, and it's important to understand that.
So when you have a big increase in costs like what we saw with fuel prices, someone has to pay for it, right? Now, either working people can be forced to pay for it in the form of higher prices at the tills and in the form of higher unemployment, or businesses can be forced to pay for it in the form of lower profits.
In other words, how we combat expensive prices is not neutral. There's a choice behind it. A political choice about who ultimately pays the bill. The first wave of increased prices started just after the COVID crisis, when the economy needed to wake up from the coma of lockdowns. That happened with a very sputtering and rusty restart, Grace explains.
There were a lot of issues in supply chains that meant that goods couldn't be moved to where they needed to be. There were shortages, as you mentioned, rates of shipping rates increased dramatically, which have a direct impact on consumer prices. So there were, the veins and arteries of the global economy got clogged up, basically, and it took a while for those pressures to ease.
It was a huge mess during that period of restart. Containers were there where they shouldn't be and weren't where they needed to be. There was a shortage of dockers and lorry drivers as they'd been put on unemployment during the pandemic. The entire transport system went haywire, and only then did you see how intimately our world is interconnected. For example, When the economy restarted, a massive number of semiconductors were needed. Semiconductors are electronic chips, and they're in everything, in our mobile phones, in our refrigerators, in our cars. And if there's a shortage of semiconductors, the price of those cars, those mobile phones, and those refrigerators will skyrocket, and the containers in which all products were transported also became very expensive. And that's the first reason why prices went up.
Profits, on the other hand, have been extraordinary, driven in part by fossil fuel companies making astonishingly high profits on the back of higher prices, but also other large, powerful corporations that have been able to use this as an excuse to raise prices even further.
High prices in order to make extraordinarily high profits, and indeed the big container companies, the big food giants, and the 5 big oil companies have made insane profits during that period. Those numbers are unimaginable. It's those excess profits and those extra margins that have pushed prices up further. And that's the second factor of price increases. And then there's a third factor, the climate.
And you also have climate breakdown, which is very often ignored as part of the drivers of inflation. But we've seen a real increase in extreme weather events in places that produce a lot of food. So crop yields are already going down for lots of reasons. We've interrupted the nitrogen cycle, and there's been a lot of soil erosion because of ecological factors. And there are extreme weather events that have destroyed a lot of food. And this is, I think, the thing that is going to potentially give us higher inflation over the long term, because we're going to carry on seeing extreme weather events. We're going to carry on seeing soil erosion, soil degradation, conflict over resources in a world where there are fewer resources to go around. And what that is going to mean is there will be disruptions in supply chains, and there will probably be inflation going into the long run as well.
A sputtering restart of the economy, skyrocketing food and oil prices, and a raging climate crisis have pushed prices to a maximum. How do we solve this? In the dominant economic mindset, there's only one answer to raise interest rates.
It's absolutely crazy that this is still the default assumption of economists and policymakers, which is that when inflation goes up, regardless of what causes that, the only solution is to then raise interest rates. Now, this goes back to a particular type of basically neoliberal economic thinking. The famous phrase that Milton Friedman used was that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. So it has to be managed through monetary policy. And the main monetary policy tool that central banks have is interest rates. Interest rates as a policy tool really impose costs on some people over others. They're a political thing because they change the balance of power in society.
Classic economists want to raise interest rates in order to slow down the economy or even bring it into recession. If interest rates go up, borrowing money becomes more expensive. Taking out a loan for a home will cost you more money, but loans for companies are also becoming more expensive. That way, they want less investments and the economy to slow down. And that should bring prices down, they say. But there's more to it, and for that, we may have to go back in time to 1979. At that time, right-wing Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher came to power in the UK, and Thatcher immediately provides a real shock therapy by drastically raising interest rates.
You also had this use of kind of interest rate shock therapy. They said that workers demanding wage increases in line with inflation was what was causing inflation, even though that kind of doesn't really make any sense because they were just arguing for wage rises in line with prices. But they said, we need to stop this, we need to kind of cut the cord, and to do that, we basically have to create a massive increase in unemployment. And obviously when interest rates go up, businesses can't afford to invest, so they start laying people off. Often you get firms going under because they can't afford to pay their debts. It becomes more expensive for households to borrow, so they can't consume as much. It creates this downward spiral of expectations and demand that leads to higher unemployment, which makes it harder for workers to bargain. If you know that your job is under threat because of this widespread environment of unemployment, you are less likely to feel powerful enough to work within a union to demand higher wages, because you're scared of losing your job, basically. And that, unemployment reached, I think it was 5 million at its peak in 1983, 1982 in the UK. It got very high as well in the US. And that was the second, strike, basically, that cut down the labour movement. And it's been in decline. It had been in decline in the UK and the US as well ever since then.
In 1980 and 1981, the United Kingdom plunged into the deepest recession since the war. Private and public investments took a nosedive. Companies went bankrupt, and the manufacturing industry in the north of England was fatally affected. 3 million unemployed paid the price of the Thatcher therapy. In parts of the Midlands, the once so proud industrial belt of the UK, unemployment rose to more than 30%. And to this day, those working-class communities have not been able to recover from this blow. One of Margaret Thatcher's collaborators at the time was the economist Alan Budd. 10 years later, the BBC asked him how he looks back on that period. Alan Budd remains cautious, but what he says is clear. A number of people in the British establishment at the time saw raising interest rates as a very, very good way to raise unemployment. And that, in turn, was an excellent means of breaking the back of the working class.
The 1970s moment is a very interesting one to study because it was a point at which a crisis was exploited by a particular set of people to dramatically change the structure of society. So prior to that 1970s moment, look at the UK, look at many economies around the world, there had been this social democratic, corporatist model of economic growth, where you had a strong labour movement that worked with business and with the government to basically decide levels of output, interest rate, lots of macroeconomic variables. There was this kind of broad bargaining that took place to determine economic policy. And there were lots of vested interests, basically, neoliberal economists, business people, who didn't like the way that model worked because it gave workers a seat at the table through the labour movement. Unions, they argued, were basically too powerful. And the crisis of the 1970s was used by those people as a way of disciplining workers into not just accepting higher rates of unemployment and lower wages, but actually it was used as a way of kind of destroying the institutional foundations of the labour movement in order to undermine social democracy.
Let's recap. Our food, our energy, our housing are too expensive, and our wages are too low. The corona crisis, the climate crisis, and the hunger for profit of a number of large multinationals have brought us here. And we're now faced with a choice. Either we choose to tap into those extra profit margins of big businesses, or we choose to moderate wages and make new cuts. Traditional politics choose to slow down the economy or even bring it into recession altogether. That way, they want to keep wages low. And that is the shock therapy that some dream of today. To make that liberal dream come true, they want to finish off the labour movement. There should be no force that can push back, that's the idea. Unions must be restrained so that the playing field is free for lower wages and higher profits.
I personally think, and there is some evidence to suggest, that the people making these decisions knew exactly what they were doing. There was a leaked document, well actually I think it was released, from Janet Yellen saying in the 1990s, I think, we basically need to engineer a recession to discipline workers into accepting lower wages. Now, obviously, they wouldn't necessarily have thought of this in terms of what it is, which is class war, but that is still the consequence. The consequence was we need to basically put people out of work in order to push through our version of economic common sense, or to push through our version of this economic model. And even if you say that this is a project that you can understand purely through reference to economic theory, so even if you say it has nothing to do with promoting the interests of one class over another, the people making those decisions should have known what the implications would be. And I would argue that they did know, and they either wanted those implications to come through, they either wanted to create higher unemployment to castigate the labour movement, or they just didn't particularly care.
Margaret Thatcher's choice to take on the working class was not an accident. It was a strategy with a deliberate aim to break the counterforce in society.
Thatcher and the neoliberals made it their mission to destroy that legacy, to really say, yes, this is the birthplace of unionism and it will be where unionism dies, basically. They wanted to destroy those institutions and to create the society that we have today. So yes, destroying the unions was about destroying the unions. It was about getting rid of these institutions that were considered a menace. But it was also, as I've mentioned, about really promoting individualism. Thatcher said there's no such thing as society. She said the method is economic, but the object is to change the soul. She wanted to change the soul. That's a Thatcher quote. This was a part of...
She managed to do this.
Yeah, totally, exactly. This was a real coherent strategy aimed at creating a society of isolated, atomized individuals who would compete with one another rather than ever attempting to cooperate as a class against the class that was dominating them. And it largely succeeded.
Changing the soul of society, those are strong words. Thatcher wanted to end every sense of collectivity and togetherness.
The firepower of the state is used to engineer recession, to cause unemployment and push down wages, at the same time as the big businesses will be bailed out. The big financial institutions will be bailed out.
And everyone knows it.
Exactly. So state power is being used to punish workers and bail out bankers. And when you have that kind of very stark dichotomy, it kind of becomes politically untenable. It is no wonder that in the US, the right is focusing so much on the culture wars. Because if we were having this discussion ever about just the astonishing unfairness at the heart of the American economy, the right would never be in power again. But as long as they're able to focus on nonsense issues and, basically stir up hate against scapegoats, then they're safe.
The lightning rods, the culture wars, the new measures to curb industrial actions. You can also see all of that as a sign of fear.
We demand and we are united. We will not be divided on the basis of who we work for. We will not be divided on the basis of our belief or the colour of our skin. We are the working class. We are
is back. In the United Kingdom, there's a huge wave of protests. But you also saw it in France, where there were 3.4 million demonstrators against the pension plans. And in Germany, union membership is increasing again. And today in the United States, they're even talking about a new summer of strike.
If you are one individual going up against a system of global capitalism, change seems impossible. That's why people become so overwhelmed and angry and upset about climate change, because they look at the scale of the problem and then they look at themselves as one person and they think, what can I do? All I can do is stop shopping in certain places or buy a tote bag or become a vegan. And that is fundamentally disempowering, and it creates a sense of nihilism. Often people just disengage from politics when they have that realization. But if you are able to create a situation in which people see, oh, okay, I can organize with other people to change things. That could be something as small as, I want to stop my local library being closed, so I'm coming together with other people from my community to demand that. Just having that experience of organizing collectively to achieve a goal, you can then project that out and say, oh, I want the government to change its policy on X. What do I have to do? I have to organize. I want, to stop this big fossil fuel company from drilling in my area or from dumping toxic waste. What can I do? I can organize with other people to demand that they change that. So yeah, I think that changing the spirit of our society from an individualistic one to one with a recognition of the importance of collective power is the biggest challenge that the left faces today.
Collective power, that's what we need. And it's here today in the new wave of struggle.
There's much less of a recognition of the idea that actually you could work together with the people around you in the workplace to demand higher wages as a group. And that is something that I know a lot of people in the labour movement are working to push. Lots of campaigns from actually a lot of bigger unions aiming to engage young people. And we've seen some successes. So there's this show in the UK called Love Island, which is like a reality show. And, it's very silly, basically. But when this whole summer of discontent was happening, one of the former contestants who had worked as an air stewardess came out and said, I support unions, unions are great, We've just seen Margot Robbie, who obviously has the lead part in the Barbie movie, say that she supports unions because all the Teamsters are on strike in the US. So I think there's some greater cultural recognition of the labour movement.
The pandemic and the price crisis have brought the concept of social class back to the forefront. Those who live off labour are in a different social category than those who live off capital. Your class determines where you work, where and how you live, what you eat. Your class affects your health, your children's education, and often your chances in court. Class matters. And that awareness is growing, a new class consciousness. Together, you can achieve much more than when you stand alone. You're stronger when you're organised. The healthcare workers who I mentioned at the beginning are not only striking for their wages, they're also angry because the care of their patients is coming under pressure. They're striking because they want a good national health service.
The fact that we've seen successful strikes being organised throughout the NHS is a testament to how bad things have gotten in the NHS. You know, people are very proud of the NHS as a kind of, British institution, as a UK institution, but it is under threat. So if you look at the number of people that are on waiting lists for certain kinds of surgeries, there are people dying on waiting lists. There are people waiting 2 hours more sometimes for an ambulance. The benefits of this for the Conservatives are very obvious, because people will look at declining standards within the NHS and start to think, well, the NHS doesn't work, so I'm withdrawing my support for this institution and I'm going to start using private providers. So yeah, I mean, the NHS is absolutely under threat, and doctors and nurses strike not just because they are under immense amounts of pressure, they are, but if you speak to them, they're worried about their patients, they're worried about the future of the NHS.
People are worried about their future, but also about the future of society. Over the past year, we've seen more and more examples of how these concerns are transformed into organisation, together and not alone, and how that togetherness also stimulates self-confidence.
We are here. We are demanding change. We refuse to be poor, and we are going to win for our people on our terms.
Recently, I heard about the Round Robin for the first time. The Round Robin was a petition from sailors who stood up for their rights. They drew a circle, and in that circle the sailors wrote their demands. And around that circle, everyone could write their name. The advantage of that was that no one could see who had actually started the petition, and the more names were placed around that circle, the more powerful that instrument became. And the slogan of the Round Robin was, "One and all together."
We have an incredibly important and valuable place in this society, which is to encourage people to believe that things can be different.
Here in London, I sense a new movement. I feel it in every raindrop, every gust of wind, every rattling subway. The winds of change are also present in Los Angeles, in Johannesburg, in Marseille, So I follow the trail of the mutiny and head to Germany. We'll see each other there in the next episode.